Freedom is a necessary precondition for life. So to the oppressors who seek to enslave others, who seek to enslave and exploit others, freedom will always be an obstacle for you to overcome, for yourself as well as for your soon-to-be oppressed victims, instead of something to respect.
You look at when it's happened historically. You look at Martin Niemöller, was a Protestant minister imprisoned by the Nazis. And he very famously, after he was released, he lived. He was one of those fortunate ones who lived. And people asked him, how is it that you, as a German, as a Protestant, as a white German, how is it you were imprisoned by the Nazis? And he said, well, first they came for the socialists. I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't say anything. And then they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't a trade unionist, so I remained silent. And then they came for the Jews. I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak up. And then they came for me. There was nobody to speak in our society. You look at the atrocity of abortion, so many have remained silent. It's a slippery slope. First we're killing children. Then it's don't ask, don't tell. Now it's this gender-bending kind of don't ask, don't be a bigot, don't be unreasonable, don't be unenlightened, heaven forbid. Be people who are bold. America needs it. Somebody asked me yesterday, I did an interview, and they said, do you think it's possible, if Hillary Clinton were to win the election, do you think it's possible that we'll be able to survive, that would we ever be able to recover as a nation? And while there are people who have stood on the stage and said we would not, I would beg to differ, but I will tell you this. I do think it would be possible, but at what price? At what price? The roots of the tree of liberty are watered by what? The blood of who? The tyrants, to be sure, but who else? The patriots. Whose blood will be shed? It may be that of those in this room. It might be that of our children and grandchildren. I have 9 children. It breaks my heart to think that it might be their blood that is needed to redeem something, to reclaim something that we, through our apathy and our indifference, have given away.
The day that he bombed the Murrah building in Oklahoma City in 1995, Timothy McVeigh wore a t-shirt that bore Thomas Jefferson's words with an image of a tree with blood dripping from its branches. These are the exact same words that Matt Bevin, the governor of Kentucky, the tyrant, the Donald Trump-like tyrant, the hedge fund manager, the carpetbagger from New Hampshire, said a week ago at the Family Research Council Action, which is an absolutely despicable organization.
Be people who are bold. America needs it. Somebody asked me yesterday, I did an interview, and they said, do you think it's possible if Hillary Clinton were to win the election, do you think it's possible that we'll be able to survive, that would we ever be able to recover as a nation? And while there are people who have stood on this stage and said we would not, I would beg to differ, but I will tell you this. I do think it would be possible, but at what price? At what price? The roots of the tree of liberty are watered by what? The blood of who? The tyrants, to be sure, but who else? The patriots. Whose blood will be shed? It may be that of those in this room. It might be that of our children and grandchildren. I have 9 children. It breaks my heart to think that it might be their blood that is needed to redeem something, to reclaim something that we, through our apathy and our indifference, have given away.
Kentucky is fart because of our tyrant, hedge fund manager, wealthy bigot Matt Bevin royally fart. Here's some background info to that blood and tyrants and patriots quote. Thomas Jefferson is the one who wrote that blood of tyrants and patriots quote in a letter to James Madison when Thomas Jefferson was serving as the U.S. ambassador to France on January 30th, 1787. January 30th, 1787, that's 4 years after the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution and 8 months before the illegal and secret Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and 2 years before George Washington would become the 18th president of the United States. It was during the days of the Articles of Confederation. The letter and subsequent quote was in regards to Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was when 4,000 Revolutionary War veterans who were having their lands and homes confiscated away by auction, by courts, by the war bonding bankers from Boston. And most of the war bonds were concentrated with a small group of wealthy people in Boston. And in order to get the full value of their war bonds, tax laws were passed. And since Daniel Shays and others were having their homes and land auctioned off, Daniel Shays and 4,000 Revolutionary War veterans started a war. And there were many battles. Shays' Rebellion only started out, though, as an intimidating peaceful protest by the Massachusetts County Conventions to stop courts from auctioning the war veterans' home and land off. And they would circle the courts with guns and cavalry and swords and bayonets. And they threatened to kill the authorities who stole the American Revolutionary War veterans' lands, cows, crops, and homes, their gold, silver, and copper. And this tactic was actually started previously in the Revolution of 1774 against the British, when the county conventions would intimidate, would wolf pack the British authorities to stop their tyranny. At one glorious moment during Shays' Rebellion, after the authorities told the rebels to disperse away from the courthouse, one of the Shayites walked up to the main commander and he put a sprig of hemlock in his hat. He didn't call it macaroni, but afterwards, sprigs of hemlocks became the defining symbol of Shays' Rebellion. In Rhode Island, paper money was being printed so that the farmers and ex-Revolutionary War veterans could pay their debts off. But the talk of being paid in unsound fiat paper currency in Massachusetts didn't make the Boston war bond holder bankers happy. They wanted the taxes to be paid with the war veterans' copper, their silver, and their gold. And if they couldn't pay with that, then their land and their property and their homes and their cows and their crops. That's all that would make the wealthy businessmen from Boston happy. This was taxation without representation. And Shays and the 4,000 American Revolutionary War veterans were rebelling over that. Does that sound familiar? Thomas Jefferson was actually excited about Shays' Rebellion. And Thomas Jefferson was not freaked out about Shays' Rebellion as Henry Knox, Samuel Adams, and James Madison were, nor the lawyers and the slave plantation owners and the ship owners and the New England Boston bond holding bankers were. They were scared. The political elite were shaking in their boots. Old TJ, Thomas Jefferson, thought that the U.S. actually could use a little rebellion now and then, and he believed in a little rebellion now and then was a good thing. TJ looked at rebellions as necessary in the political world, just as storms were in the physical world, a kind of cleansing process, like a forest fire that burns the debris and fertilizes the soil for the life that survives. Malo periculosum libertatem quam quietam servitutem. This is a Latin phrase that Thomas Jefferson also wrote in his letter. And it means, I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. Even this evil is productive of good, wrote Thomas Jefferson. It prevents the degeneracy of the government and nourishes a general attention to the public affairs. It was a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion, wrote Thomas Jefferson. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Daniel Shays was born in 1747 in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, and he was the son of two Irish immigrants, Patrick and Margaret Dempsey Shays. Daniel was the second of 6 siblings. He spent his early years as a landless farm laborer. So, very humble origins as a sharecropper. In 1772, Daniel Shays married Abigail Gilbert, with whom he settled in Brookfield, Massachusetts. Daniel Shays was a poor farmhand when the Revolution broke out. Daniel Shays joined the Continental Army and then became a sergeant and then a lieutenant. So Sergeant Lieutenant Daniel Shays fought valiantly in the American Revolution, a war that allowed George Washington to keep on raping his 318 slaves on the thousands of acres that he had stole from the Native Americans and war veterans. In 1780, John Adams borrowed $5 million from the Netherlands for war, and those bondholders expected to be paid back. Daniel Shays fought in the Boston campaign. Daniel Shays fought in the Battle of Lexington and Bunker Hill and Ticonderoga. Daniel Shays fought Burgoyne's invading army at Saratoga, New York, and he fought in the desperate action at Stony Point, New York. Daniel Shays had been shot during the American Revolution. He had grape shot, a load of British lead lodged in his ass. Daniel Shays was a wounded war veteran, and he wasn't paid for his services. General Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, the French general who volunteered and came to fight with the American revolutionaries, so-called revolutionaries. General Lafayette had honored Captain Shays along with other officers under his command by giving them a ceremonial sword as a mark of his personal esteem, but Daniel Shays was being taxed without being represented. He wasn't paid a military commission. He was being taxed by the local, state, federal officials. He was being taxed every which way. And then he was taken to court twice in order to pay for those taxes. Daniel Shays had to sell that ceremonial sword that the Marquis de Lafayette gave him just to pay his bills. But Daniel Shays kept the cutlass sword that he had used at the Battle of Bunker Hill. After finding himself in court for non-payment of debts, Daniel Shays saw that he wasn't the only one who was struggling. Mothers were forced to beg in the street. There was one sick woman who was unable to pay, had her bed taken out from underneath her. And Daniel Shays was looking to lose his cows and crops and land. He had a wife and 3 or more children, at least 1 son and 2 daughters, and all of them looked to him to provide for them. And to add insult to injury, if Daniel Shays lost his land, then Daniel Shays would cease to be an American citizen, since the status quo in antebellum America was that only white male landowners could vote. After the American War of Independence, more than half the people in the United States were excluded from citizenship, such as the Native Americans, black people, women, and landless whites. The French Revolution was a revolution. The Haitian Revolution was a revolution. The American Revolution, not so much. It was a war for independence. We severed our ties with Britain. It was George Washington's war. Daniel Shays started participating in the so-called illegal county conventions. In one of those so-called illegal county conventions, a man named Plow Jogger spoke his mind, and Plow Jogger said, "I have been greatly abused. I have been obliged to do more than my part in the war, been loaded with class rates, town rates, province rates, continental rates, and all rates, been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and had my cattle sold for less than they were worth. The great men are going to get all we have, and I think it is time for us to rise and put a stop to it, and have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collectors, nor lawyers." What brought Daniel Shays fully into the rebellion was on September 19th, 1786. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts met in Worcester, W-O-R-C-E-S-T-E-R, and they indicted 11 leaders of Luke Day's rebellion. Luke Day being another American Revolutionary War veteran, fighting to keep his land, keep his houses and property and crops and cattle from being auctioned off. And 11 leaders of his rebellion were being indicted, and they included 3 of Daniel Shays' friends. They were called disorderly, riotous, and seditious persons who unlawfully and by force of arms prevented the execution of justice and the laws of the Commonwealth. The Supreme Judicial Court planned to meet again in Springfield a week later, and there was talk of Luke Day being indicted. Daniel Shays organized 700 armed farmers, most of them veterans of the war, and led them to Springfield. There they found a general with 900 soldiers and a cannon, so they were outnumbered. Daniel Shays rode right up to the general and asked for permission to parade, which the general granted, to peacefully parade. So Daniel Shays and his men moved through the square. The drums were hanging and the fifes were blowing. As they marched, their ranks grew. Some of the militia joined them, and reinforcements began coming in from the countryside. The judges eventually postponed hearings for a day, and then they completely adjourned the court. Daniel Shays was successful in peacefully closing the courts down, and that made the elites scared beyond all redemption. The Shayites had tried to petition their governments. They tried to gain the favor of the political elite through peaceful means, but the political elite remained completely blind, and nobody could hold government office unless they were wealthy. So what else could Daniel Shays do? Henry Knox wrote to George Washington, and he said, "The people who are the insurgents have never paid any or but very little taxes, but they see the weakness of government. They feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent and their own force, and they are determined to make use of the latter, their own force, in order to remedy the former, their own poverty. Their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice, and ought to be swept from off the face of the earth." Massachusetts declared martial law. Samuel Adams passed a riot act, which said that if the government construed a peaceful assembly of 12 or more people in a party, if they construed that as a negative purpose, then those individuals could be arrested without trial. Samuel Adams said, "In monarchy, the crime of treason may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death." Eventually, Benjamin Lincoln raised money by the rich bond-holding bankers and businessmen of Boston to finance an army of mercenaries like the Pinkertons or Blackwater, whatever their name is now, or Omar Mateen of G4S, or those security guards, sick and attack dogs on the Osheti Sakowin in North Dakota, who are fighting to protect our water, and water being the first medicine. Benjamin Lincoln and the war bond holders had to raise their own private militia because the federal government under the Articles of Confederation didn't have the jurisdiction to intervene. And the militia of Massachusetts were in solidarity with Luke Day and John Bly and Charles Rose and Daniel Shays. General Benjamin Lincoln paid 3,000 turncoat men at Worcester to fight the rebels. The Shays Rebellion would eventually be defeated in battle against these mercenaries, but it took over a year to completely subdue. It was called Shays Rebellion because rebellion is a revolution that failed, like Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, Bacon's Rebellion, the Easter Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion. A rebellion is a failed revolution, and that was Shays' biggest mistake. Even though what he was doing was right and proper and good, he didn't fight a war that he knew he could win. When George Washington illegally rebelled against tyranny, against the authorities, he got his face on every single one of our dollar bills. But when Daniel Shays rebelled, he lost. And he got John Bly and Charles Rose killed. 4,000 men in Shays Rebellion had to sign confessions that they participated in Shays Rebellion, that they renounced Shays Rebellion, and that they pledged allegiance to the United States. 18 men, including Daniel Shays, were convicted and sentenced to death. The war bond holders, private army, crushed Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion was fought from August 31st, 1786 to about June 1787, though John Bly and Charles Rose were executed in December 1787. The illegal U.S. Constitutional Convention was held between May 25th to September 17th, 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So the Constitutional Convention was held during Shays Rebellion, right at the tail end of the violent, bloody struggle. The 1787 Constitutional Convention was a secret, illegal, overthrow the government convention, which the public wasn't even allowed to attend. At that illegal 1787 Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, the 55 so-called demigod elite were extremely worried about Shays Rebellion. They were really upset about it. Letters were flying back and forth between them. The U.S. Constitution represented the economic interest of the 55 wealthy individuals who attended. The 1787 U.S. Constitution is a class-based document. Most of the 55 demigods who attended the Constitutional Convention were lawyers and landowners, slave owners, and war bond holders. They were against paper money. 55 mostly rich white men, and they wanted a government strong enough to protect their own economic interests. The manufacturers to protect Native American land stealers, to use force to keep slavery, and of course to protect the war bond holders. James Madison, the architect of the U.S. Constitution, wrote that the point of the government is that it ought to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. To protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. To protect the rich from the poor. The minority of the rich from the masses of poor. James Madison said, "The man who is possessed of wealth, who lolls on his sofa or rolls in his carriage, cannot judge the wants or feelings of the day laborer. The government we mean to erect is intended to last for ages. The landed interest at present is prevalent, but in process of time, when we approximate to the states and kingdoms of Europe, when the number of landholders shall be comparatively small through the various means of trade and manufactures, will not the landed interest be overbalanced in future elections? And unless wisely provided against, what will become of your government? In England, at this day, if elections were open to all classes of people, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would soon take place. An agrarian law will soon take place. If these observations be just, our government ought to secure the permanent interest of the country against innovation. Landholders ought to have a share in the government to support these invaluable interests and to balance and check the other. They ought to be so constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The Senate, therefore, ought to be this body, and to answer these purposes, they ought to have permanency and stability." James Madison was worried about an agrarian law, land reform. He was against land reform. He didn't want the masses to get a piece of the land that the elite had stole from Native Americans or from the Tories and had slaves working on their land. On September 17th, 1787, the U.S. Constitution was signed into law. Article 4 of Section 4 said, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. And on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence." Shays Rebellion. The Shays Rebellion was very pervasive with the U.S. Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They wanted a stronger central government to be set up so that it was a government strong enough to suppress rebellions, a Leviathan, to protect settlers and expansionists who moved into Indian territory, a government that could raise an army so they could suppress working class rebellions and to suppress slave rebellions. After the Constitutional Convention, Thomas Jefferson was deeply concerned about some of the proposals for the new United States Constitutions, particularly the role of the executive branch, which he saw as being far too powerful. Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to William S. Smith, a diplomat official in London, on November 13th, 1787, "Wonderful is the effect of impudent and persevering litigant. The British ministry have so long hired their gazetteers to repeat and model into every form lies about our being an anarchy that the world has at length believed them. The English nation has believed them. The ministers themselves have come to believe them, and what is more wonderful, we have believed them ourselves. Yet where does this anarchy exist? Where did it ever exist except for the single instance of Massachusetts? And can history produce an instance of rebellion so honorably conducted? God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is a lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. We have had 13 states independent for 11 years. There has been one rebellion. That comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts, and in the spur of the moment they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order. Samuel Adams, a tyrant, called for bloodshed against the Patriots, and that's why on December 6, 1787, after the U.S. Constitution was written up at an illegal convention, a convention that banned all members of the public from attending, a constitution that did not include a Bill of Rights, John Bly and Charles Rose, December 6, 1787, were hung to death for participating in Shays' Rebellion. John Bly and Charles Rose were hung to death for stealing weapons. On their last day on earth, John Bly and Charles Rose found themselves surrounded by a preacher, a militia, and numerous concourse of spectators, a bunch of looky-loos. Luke Day and Daniel Shays, the leader of Shays' Rebellion, would be pardoned, but they would die in poverty and obscurity.